All right, everyone, here we go, part two. So today we're going to be continuing our look at the Cold War by introducing the Vietnam War. Now, the Vietnam War is really going to be the most important conflict of the Cold War from the US's perspective. It's one that really impacted every aspect of American life. It's a really major event in world history in general in the 20th century. And it's going to have far-reaching impacts beyond just the military or the Cold War or a variety of things like that. So, today we're going to be looking primarily at just the kind of introduction of the war, the beginnings of the war, how we start to ramp up our commitment to Vietnam, and kind of who is on which side. So, really basic stuff, but important stuff to understand so that next week we can dive into the Vietnam War fully, kind of understand some of the major events and why they're so important. Alright, so background to the war. Well, Vietnam, okay, has been intervened with, conquered, controlled by various nations throughout its entire history, Vietnam/Indochina. It's in a great location, has a lot of resources, and so people were always coveting this piece of land. Well, China controlled what was known as Indochina for about 2,000 years. Okay? Then the French in the 1600s sent missionaries and traders, and then eventually gained control of the entire colony, making it one of their most prized colonies during the colonial period. Then in World War II, the Japanese invaded Vietnam and took it from the French and controlled it for the majority of World War II. Then the French regained control of Vietnam in 1945 and kept it until 1954. And then 1954 is really where we pick up this story of the Vietnamese fighting for their independence. Now, I'm going to go just right off the bat here and say this. To us, at least at the time, we viewed the Vietnam War as a part of the Cold War. Okay, we viewed it as a part of the Cold War. We viewed it as a part of the domino theory. That was just the next domino to fall after China and Korea. Whereas in reality, that's not what it was. It wasn't really a part of the Cold War. Not entirely, at least. It was to some extent, but not entirely. It was primarily a war of independence for the Vietnamese people. Right? If you understood their past, you would understand that they had been controlled by different nations for the better part of 2,500 years, and therefore were kind of looking to rule themselves, right, as an ethnic group, as a people, whereas that had not been previously possible. Well, at the time, though, we viewed it as definitely a part of the Cold War, right? That's saying if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think that kind of applies here. And so the fifth stage is us intervening to prevent the spread of communism. And that's what we're going to be focusing on for the next 2 weeks. So, background to the war. Well, the French lost control, as they do in most wars, to Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. I know I'm mispronouncing that. I'm sorry. Now, Ho Chi Minh was the leader of what was at the time or would later become North Vietnam, the Vietnamese Revolutionary Forces or Independence Forces, the Viet Minh. Okay? At the time, President Eisenhower, okay, so Truman, he's not reelected, Eisenhower becomes president. At the time, Eisenhower declined to intervene on behalf of France. He was looking for appeasement, didn't really want to help out the French, and basically just let the French fall. Later on, though, we would kind of go back on that and think maybe, hey, we should have done that and, nipped it in the bud instead of letting it turn into this huge major ordeal. Well, the French are defeated. Vietnam is independent, okay? And so there's a conference at Geneva in which Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel. There was divisions within Vietnam as well, okay? Ho Chi Minh's nationalist communist forces would control the north of Vietnam. Kind of like in Korea along the 38th parallel, Vietnam was split into two along the 17th parallel. And then Ngo Dinh Diem, again, sorry for the pronunciation, a French-educated Roman Catholic, claimed control of the south. Vietnam was divided between the north and south, and there was kind of various social classes within Vietnam as well. Some supported Diem, others supported Minh. Ultimately, we have kind of a similar situation in Vietnam as we did in Korea. There was a date set for which there would be democratic elections. Vietnam would be unified as one, and it would either be all under Ho Chi Minh's control or his type of leadership, nationalist communist, or it would be under Ngo Dinh Diem's control as a pseudo-democracy, if you will. Okay? Well, Diem realized that he would lose this. Diem was really only popular with the upper class and the Catholic in Vietnam, which was a minority for sure. And so he backs out of the elections, essentially leading to a military conflict between the North and the South. The US then starts to get involved as well. Now, Diem, like I said, despite being not communist, which was a very big positive in the US's view, he was not that great of a guy. Okay, his family had complete control over the country. Wealth was hoarded by the elite. He persecuted the Buddhist religious majority. He himself being a Catholic, as many or some Vietnamese converted during the French regime. And there was essentially just lack of freedom. Torture was everywhere. Freedom of speech was non-existent. Freedom of the press was non-existent. But he was not communist. And for the US at the time, that was a very positive thing. And so the US supported his government by sending financial and military aid. And by 1960, the US had sent 675 army advisors. Now, remember, we weren't officially at war. So this is kind of where this gray area begins, although you could argue it had already begun before that. But if we're not at war, you can't send troops. And so what we did was we sent, quote-unquote, advisors, right, in order to help support the South Vietnamese government. But as you can clearly see, we're getting involved in this war. Now, there were many protests of Diem's government, the most famous being a Buddhist monk who, in protest of the anti-Buddhist policies of Diem's regime, set himself on fire in a busy square. This picture became one of the most famous pictures of the 20th century, and it was shown around the world, and it really captured the brutality of Diem's regime, and obviously, by association, the US support of his regime. Okay, so things weren't looking very good at this point. So President Kennedy gets elected in 1960 after Eisenhower, and he increases the number of military advisors to 16,000. I don't know, but to me that sounds like a lot of advisors, maybe too many chefs in the kitchen. But ultimately, that's what he did. Again, not necessarily following the constitutional path of, hey, Congress has to declare war. Congress didn't want to declare war. Kennedy wanted to not lose Vietnam, just like how China was lost and how Korea was kind of lost. And so he sends in more advisors. Diem, at this point, were very unpopular because of the protests against him and the treatment of the Buddhists and his suppression of freedom of speech. And so Kennedy basically gives the okay to a coup d'etat. Leaders in the Vietnamese military murder Diem and his brother and seize control of the country, and at this point, they are in control of the country. Now, I think JFK probably thought this would be better than Diem, but essentially the Vietnamese military were only interested in fighting over control of the country, not necessarily doing what JFK wanted, which was to defeat the communists. And then a few weeks later, Kennedy was assassinated. So we have this whole mess, and the person who, to some degree, started it is no longer in charge. And so now we have this mess being kind of passed along. That's another really important trend to the Vietnam War, is it's kind of the can being kicked down the road. No president wants to lose the Vietnam War, and so he keeps it going on until the next president takes it over. Because, as we'll see, we could have won the Vietnam War, but we didn't want to start World War III. Again, a trend of the Cold War. Had we just sent in all of our forces to invade North Vietnam? Yeah, it'd been over in a week. But we couldn't do that because we knew, or thought at least, that if we did that, China and the Soviet Union would declare war and World War III would start. So we had to kind of limit ourselves to containment, but at the same time, we couldn't do so little that we would lose the war. And so we were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So then we have Lyndon Baines Johnson, the next president, who takes over after Kennedy's assassinated. Now, Johnson remembers that Truman lost China, and this whole domino theory idea was revived, that Vietnam was just the next domino to fall. And so Johnson started to send more and more ground forces into South Vietnam to defeat the North Vietnamese in order to prevent himself from being the president that saw Southeast Asia go the way China went, as he famously said. Then we have kind of as in World War I, there was some sort of spark that was necessary to start the war. We have another spark in the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, this is a very controversial incident, and I'll try to demystify it as much as possible. Okay? There's two incidents, really. On August 2nd, 1964, the U.S. ship, the Maddox, was attacked by the North Vietnamese. On August 4th, 1964, the Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy, another ship, were also supposedly attacked. However, in reality, these things didn't truly happen. There may have been some shots fired at the first ship because it did sail into North Vietnamese waters, but the attacks on August 4th were never truly confirmed. There were some things seen on the sonar. People thought they were torpedoes, but they were probably dolphins or some other animal, not actual torpedoes. However, LBJ didn't need these events to be 100% factually correct. All he needed was Congress to believe that they were correct. And so, he goes to Congress, and Congress passes a resolution called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which essentially says, hey, Johnson, if you want to send troops in response to this, you can, even without us approving a war. So this essentially gave Johnson carte blanche, or a blank check, to go into Vietnam and do whatever he wanted without Congress approving the war. This was kind of a win-win for Congress. Many people in Congress did want to go to war, but declaring war is not popular and you might lose your seat to the next elections. And so essentially they were able to give him the permission to go to war without really declaring war. And here it is. So we'll do this as a summary, not a warm-up, but just go ahead and define these items on your Google Doc. Ho Chi Minh, Dien Bien Phu, Ngo Dinh Diem, and then the Gulf of Tonkin incident and resolution. Why are these? Who are these people? What are these things? And why are they important? Okay, on your Google Doc. Next week, we'll go into the meat of the Vietnam War once the Vietnam War truly escalates and we start seeing massive amounts of troops and weapons being deployed and bombing being undertaken, and we'll see kind of the real most important years of the Vietnam War. But today was really just to kind of get you guys to understand the basics and the background of the Vietnam War. All right. Hope you guys enjoyed. Talk to you next week.